What truly happens behind HYBE's closed doors. You might think you know everything about BTS, but are you ready for the unfiltered truth straight from the agency itself? What hidden dynamics keep these 7 superstars glued together when the cameras stop rolling? Who is the secret emotional anchor? And who actually clashes before creating pure magic? Get ready to have your mind blown as we dive into the unseen brotherhood of the century. Buckle up, because here is the top 7 unique facts about BTS members' relationships, according to HYBE themselves. Are you ready? Number 7. RM. The fragile shield, a leader's hidden vulnerability. When you think of Kim Namjoon or RM, the immediate image that flashes into your mind is an unshakable pillar of strength, a towering intellectual figure who can eloquently deliver a breathtaking speech at the United Nations General Assembly without breaking a single sweat, right? However, if you were to ask the internal staff, the choreographers, and the producers pacing the echoing hallways of HYBE headquarters, they would paint a drastically different, profoundly emotional portrait of the man who carries the weight of the biggest boy band in the world on his incredibly broad shoulders. According to HYBE's own internal observations and the deeply reflective narrative shared in their docu series, the most fascinating aspect of RM's relationship with the rest of the group isn't his commanding authority, but rather his unexpected, endearing vulnerability that secretly functions as the absolute glue binding the 7 members together in a way that traditional leadership never could. Imagine, if you will, the immense, suffocating psychological pressure of being the spokesperson for a global phenomenon, the designated translator, the diplomatic shield who constantly has to absorb the chaotic energy of the media, the relentless expectations of the industry, and the protective duties toward his brothers. Yet, HYBE insiders have frequently noted a beautiful, almost poetic paradox. The moment the flashing cameras turn off, the heavy crown of leadership is instantly dismantled, and the seemingly invincible RM transforms into the universally beloved, adorably clumsy god of destruction, who desperately needs his team just to survive the simplest daily tasks. This is where the true magic of BTS's interpersonal dynamic is forged, not in a top-down hierarchy, but in a profoundly symbiotic circle of mutual reliance. Staff members have recalled countless heartwarming, tear-jerking instances in dressing rooms across the globe, from the microscopic, cramped waiting areas of their early debut days in 2013 to the sprawling, luxurious backstage suites of Wembley Stadium, where RM, completely exhausted from carrying the intellectual and communicative burden of the group, would quietly retreat into the background, practically collapsing onto a sofa while the rest of the members instinctively, silently took over the role of his caretakers. You see, while RM fiercely protects BTS from the outside world, the other 6 members have silently sworn a blood oath to protect RM from himself and the crushing gravity of his own mind. HYBE producers have watched in sheer awe as Jeon, the eldest, routinely steps in to break the suffocating tension with his windshield wiper laugh and dad jokes, specifically when he notices RM's stress levels peaking, effectively taking the emotional steering wheel so RM can just breathe for a second. Meanwhile, Suga, his longest-standing confidant and the silent co-pilot of the group, shares a telepathic, wordless understanding with RM, often exchanging a single, knowing glance across a chaotic recording studio that speaks volumes of shared trauma, countless sleepless nights, and the mutual burden of musical creation dating back to their freezing, cramped dorm in Nonhyun-dong, where they survived on cheap ramen and impossible dreams. Recall the harrowing period of 2018, a time HYBE executives now look back on with a collective shudder, when the group was secretly contemplating disbandment despite standing at the precipice of unprecedented global dominance. During those tear-soaked, agonizing closed-door meetings, it wasn't RM who stood up and delivered a domineering speech demanding they stay together. Instead, according to insider accounts, he shattered completely, laying his exhaustion and fears bare on the table, which in turn prompted a monumental outpouring of raw, unfiltered emotion from every single member. It was in that crucible of ultimate vulnerability that their bond was recast into something entirely unbreakable, proving that his transparent honesty was infinitely more powerful than any artificial bravado. But perhaps the most tear-inducing revelation from HYBE's behind-the-scenes vault is how the younger members, Jimin, V, and Jungkook, interact with their leader. They don't just respect him. They revere him with an intensity that borders on the absolute, yet they are acutely aware of his fragility. When RM loses his passport for the 100th time, breaks a prop on set, or gets tangled in his own headphone wires, the members don't scold him with the harshness you'd expect in a high-stakes corporate environment. Instead, they surround him with a chaotic, loving warmth, teasing him relentlessly while simultaneously fixing his messes. It's a phenomenon that psychological experts analyzing group dynamics would find absolutely mesmerizing. By constantly dropping his guard in private, RM strips away the toxic, hierarchical pressure that usually poisons K-pop groups from the inside out. He transforms the role of leader from a position of dictatorial authority into a position of ultimate service and sacrifice, absorbing the paralyzing fear of the unknown whenever they break into new, terrifying global markets, and translating that fear into the confident, swaggering English responses we see in American interviews, all while his brothers stand right behind him, literally and metaphorically holding his spine straight. Bang Si-hyuk himself once noted that RM's greatest strength wasn't his roaring charisma, but his profound ability to step back and let the other members shine, creating an egalitarian utopia within the group where every single voice is heard and valued. This specific dynamic, this profound reversal of roles where the followers lead the leader in the art of living, is precisely what HYBE executives believe saved BTS from the dark, soul-crushing abyss of burnout that destroys so many other groups in this cutthroat industry. RM's willingness to be completely bare, to show his absolute incompetence in mundane tasks, to cry openly when the burden feels too heavy during their legendary emotional concerts, and to desperately lean on the shoulders of his brothers, subconsciously gave the rest of the members the vital permission to be human, to be vulnerable, and to realize that their strength doesn't come from individual perfection, but from their desperate, undeniable need for each other. It is a brotherhood forged in the fires of immense pressure, tempered by the tears of shared failures, and polished by the undeniable truth that the man leading them to the very top of the musical Olympus is also the man who needs them the absolute most to find his way back down to earth safely. This is the unseen, emotionally devastating reality of RM's relationship with BTS, a reality that makes you question everything you thought you knew about leadership, power, and the true meaning of family. So, if the leader is this deeply, beautifully dependent on his team, what on earth happens when we look at the emotional bedrock of the group, the member who quietly stitches the wounds of everyone else while hiding his own scars? Are you ready to dive deeper into the rabbit hole? Let the journey continue, because we are just scratching the surface of this legendary brotherhood. Number 6. Jeon. The Mask of Laughter, the eldest's unseen sacrifice. When evaluating the foundational pillars that have kept BTS from crumbling under the unimaginable, bone-crushing pressure of global superstardom, HYBE executives and in-house psychologists consistently point to one specific, deeply misunderstood dynamic: the revolutionary, profoundly self-sacrificing role of Kim Seokjin, the group's eldest member. To the casual observer, Jeon is the undisputed worldwide handsome, the undisputed king of terrible dad jokes, and the guy who shamelessly blows flying kisses to millions of screaming fans without an ounce of hesitation. But behind the closed, soundproof doors of HYBE's imposing headquarters, the narrative surrounding Jeon is one of profound reverence, emotional intelligence, and a deliberate, almost agonizing self-erasure for the sake of his 6 younger brothers. In the highly traditional, rigidly structured society of South Korea, age is not just a number. It is an absolute hierarchy, a commanding force where the eldest, the math young, wields unquestionable authority, demands absolute respect, and dictates the atmosphere of the group. A cultural norm that has historically suffocated and ultimately destroyed countless K-pop groups from the inside out due to toxic power imbalances and suppressed communication. However, according to insider accounts from the very people who built the company from a near-bankrupt agency into a multi-billion-dollar empire, Jimin made a conscious, shockingly mature decision in the cramped, mold-infested dorms of their pre-debut days to completely dismantle this cultural expectation, voluntarily shattering his own ego and stepping down from the pedestal of the eldest brother so that the younger members could breathe, speak, and thrive without fear. Imagine the immense psychological fortitude it takes for a young man in his early 20s, originally aspiring to be a serious actor and suddenly thrust into a fierce, aggressive underground hip-hop group, to look at his terrified, homesick younger bandmates, especially a barely 15-year-old Jungkook, and decide that instead of ruling them with an iron fist, he would become their jester, their punching bag, and their ultimate safe haven. HYBE staff have frequently teared up during internal documentary interviews when recalling how Jeon would intentionally act childish, deliberately losing arguments, and throwing ridiculous, theatrical tantrums over video games or food, entirely as a calculated, deeply empathetic strategy to lower the intimidating barrier of age, ensuring that members like Jimin, V, and Jungkook would never feel scared to voice their opinions, express their frustrations, or simply be themselves around him. This invisible sacrifice, this daily choice to play the fool so his brothers could feel powerful, is regarded by Bang Si-hyuk himself as the absolute cornerstone of BTS's legendary, unbreakable teamwork, a miraculous dynamic that allowed a leader like RM, who is actually 2 years younger than Jeon, to comfortably lead the group without the agonizing friction of stepping on his elder's toes. But the emotional depth of Jin's contribution extends far beyond his engineered goofiness. He has always been the silent, domestic anchor, the one who physically nourished their dreams when the company literally couldn't afford to, using his own limited allowance from his parents to buy groceries, cooking elaborate meals on a single, rusty portable stove, and literally driving a sleepy, overwhelmed Jungkook to his high school entrance ceremonies, acting as a surrogate parent for kids who were hundreds of miles away from their own families and paralyzed by the fear of an uncertain future. Behind the scenes, the HYBE dance trainers and vocal coaches have witnessed a heart-wrenching level of grit that sharply contrasts his breezy, confident public persona, recalling the agonizing late-night hours long after the natural dancers like J-Hope and Jimin had left the studio, where Jeon would stay behind, his body bruised and exhausted, practicing the same demanding choreography 1,000 times over in sheer, desperate panic, terrified of becoming a burden to his younger brothers who were born with innate rhythm. He never complained. He never threw his weight around as the eldest to demand easier parts or center time. Instead, he swallowed his insecurities, masked his physical exhaustion with a blinding smile, and pushed his body to the absolute breaking point purely out of love and a staggering sense of responsibility to the team's collective dream. And when the walls were finally closing in, during that devastatingly dark period in early 2018, when the physical and mental torture of their sudden, terrifying explosion into the Western mainstream almost caused them to disband, it was Jeon who took the ultimate emotional bullet for the group on the colossal stage of the Net Asian Music Awards in Hong Kong. While the other members were silently drowning in their private agonies, terrified of shattering the illusion of their perfect success story to the public, Jeon, with tears streaming down his flawless face, bravely gripped the microphone and confessed to the entire world that they had suffered, that they had cried out of sheer exhaustion, and that they had seriously considered giving up and walking away from it all. HYBE insiders note that this specific, monumental act of bravery was the ultimate manifestation of his role as the eldest. He took upon himself the terrifying risk of public backlash and investor panic, speaking the unspeakable truth so that his younger brothers wouldn't have to carry the suffocating burden of that dark secret anymore, effectively purging the group's collective trauma and allowing them to heal, cry openly on stage, and ultimately choose each other all over again. His unique, Individual relationships with the members are a masterclass in emotional adaptability. With Suga, his eternal roomie, there is a profound, silent, telepathic understanding where no words are needed, a shared, mature acknowledgement of their brutal journey from nothing to everything. With RM, he is the unwavering support system, ready to break the tension with a windshield wiper laugh the second he sees the leader's shoulders slump under the weight of an English interview. And with the Magne line, he is their eternal playground, engaging in chaotic, noisy bickering with Jungkook that HYBE psychologists recognize as a vital, stress-relieving coping mechanism for the youngest member to feel unconditionally loved and grounded in normalcy despite their abnormal stratosphere-level fame. Even during the agonizing lead-up to his mandatory military enlistment, Jeon chose to swallow his own fears, delaying his departure and performing with a throat infection in Argentina alongside Coldplay, just to ensure he could give the fans and his brothers a proper, beautiful farewell at the Busan concert without casting a shadow of sadness over their collective celebration, smiling until the very last second the cameras cut away. As the group faced the inevitable, heartbreaking reality of separation, the sheer, devastating impact of Jeon stepping into that military base proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was never just a visual or a vocalist, but the very heartbeat, the protective shield, and the comforting gravity that kept the chaotic, beautiful universe of BTS perfectly aligned. So, if the eldest brother sacrificed his ego to build a safe home for his bandmates, what happens when we examine the member who acts as the strict, uncompromising disciplinarian and the silent, musical backbone of the group? A man who built an impenetrable fortress around his heart only to let 6 specific people in? The emotional roller coaster is only getting steeper, and the revelations are only getting heavier. So hold on tight and prepare your tissues for the next truth bomb. Number 5. Suga. The Tsundere Fortress, the silent architect's blood oath. When you first lay your eyes on Min Young-yi, globally feared and revered as the razor-sharp rapper Suga, or his fiery alter ego Auguste, the immediate, overwhelming aura he projects is one of impenetrable ice, a fiercely independent, unapologetically savage artist who would rather sleep for 24 hours straight than engage in frivolous emotional displays, completely giving off the vibe of a lone wolf who accidentally stumbled into a boy band. However, if you dare to step behind the reinforced, soundproof doors of HYBE's legendary Genius Lab, the fiercely guarded sanctuary where the sonic architecture of BTS's discography is meticulously forged, the internal producers, sound engineers, and executives will tell you a shockingly different, profoundly tear-jerking story about a man whose heart is actually softer than a marshmallow, wrapped in miles of barbed wire, strictly to protect the 6 brothers he loves more than his own life. According to the deepest, most closely guarded observations from HYBE's in-house psychological team and longtime collaborators like Dog, Suga is the ultimate textbook definition of a tsundere, a Japanese term for someone who appears initially aloof and hostile, but is secretly intensely warm and caring. And this very specific, paradoxical behavioral trait is the absolute secret weapon that grounds the chaotic emotional spectrum of BTS. To truly understand the sheer magnitude of Suga's relationship with the members, you have to rewind the clock back to the brutal, freezing, mold-infested dorms of Nanhae-dong in 2012, a time of agonizing uncertainty where a young, desperately poor Yoongi, secretly working a dangerous part-time job as a delivery boy just to pay his school tuition and buy groceries for the younger trainees, was violently struck by a car, completely shattering his shoulder in the dark streets of Seoul. Terrified beyond belief that the nearly bankrupt Big Hit Entertainment would immediately kick him out of the debut lineup if they found out he was fundamentally broken, he swallowed his agonizing physical agony, hid the devastating injury behind baggy clothes, and forced himself to endure grueling, bone-crushing dance practices with tears of silent torture streaming down his face. When the truth finally spilled out, it wasn't the agency executives who held him together, but those ragged, terrified boys in the dorm who rallied around him. completely refusing to let him be cast aside, an act of unconditional loyalty that fundamentally rewired Suga's brain and forged an invisible, unbreakable blood oath within his soul. He silently vowed right then and there that he would dedicate every single ounce of his musical genius to making sure these boys conquered the entire universe. This profound trauma birthed his unique love language, which HYBE staff describe as an invisible, silent blanket of protection that hovers over the group at all times. He's the guy who will absolutely refuse to look you in the eye, grumbling under his breath about how annoying everything is, while simultaneously pushing a bottle of water into your exhausted hands without even turning his head, or quietly paying for a massive barbecue dinner for the entire team before anyone else even has the chance to reach for their wallets. The interpersonal dynamics he shares with each specific member are like masterclasses in emotional counterbalancing, particularly his legendary, universally adored bond with J-Hope, affectionately dubbed Soap by the fandom and the staff alike. Inside the agency, it is a well-known, indisputable fact that when Suga is swallowed whole by the suffocating, depressive darkness of his own artistic perfectionism, locked inside his studio for days on end battling the crippling pressure of producing their next historic, chart-topping masterpiece, J-Hope is literally the only human being on the planet allowed to barge through that locked door, radiating blinding sunshine and chaotic energy, physically dragging Yoongi out of the abyss to eat, laugh, and remember he is human. Their bond is so profound that HYBE executives still get choked up recalling that agonizing New Year's Eve during their trainee days when a deeply homesick, entirely alone J-Hope was left behind in the desolate dorm, only to be entirely shocked when Suga, who had finally been granted a rare, desperate chance to visit his own family in Daegu, suddenly walked back through the dorm door carrying a box of fried chicken, having completely sacrificed his own precious family time just so his younger brother wouldn't have to cry alone in the dark. With the towering leader RM, Suga shares a completely different, incredibly heavy telepathic connection. They are the dual, foundational pillars of the group, the two underground rappers who had to endure the excruciating humiliation of being mocked by the hip-hop community for selling out as idols, while simultaneously being ridiculed by idol fans for not fitting the pristine, manufactured visual standards, a shared, agonizing trauma that bonded them so deeply they can literally communicate across a crowded stadium stage with nothing more than a microscopic nod. But perhaps the most emotionally devastating revelation from HYBE's internal archives regarding Suga's hidden heart revolves around younger members, the Magne line consisting of Jimin, V, and Jungkook, who view him as a terrifying but fiercely loving father figure. During the catastrophic, soul-crushing period of early 2018, when the overwhelming, terrifying gravity of their sudden global explosion literally broke their mental health and pushed them to the absolute brink of disbandment, Suga did something so completely out of character it shattered the entire group's emotional dam. Knowing his younger brothers were silently drowning in anxiety and despair, this man, who notoriously loathes expressing verbal affection and cringes at the mere thought of emotional vulnerability, sat down in the dead of night and typed out agonizingly long, incredibly detailed, deeply poetic text messages to Jimin and V, pouring out his soul, validating their pain, begging them to hold on, and ending the staggering messages with the three words they had practically never heard him say: "I love you." According to HYBE staff who witnessed the aftermath, V and Jimin completely broke down, sobbing uncontrollably for hours, absolutely paralyzed by the sheer, magnificent weight of those three words coming from the most guarded, cynical man they knew, a moment that single-handedly acted as the emotional defibrillator that shocked the dying heartbeat of the group back to life and convinced them to stay together. Now, as the world holds its collective breath and the industry goes completely feral for the monumental, heavily anticipated full group 2026 reunion season, HYBE insiders have begun to secretly whisper that it was precisely Yoongi's meticulous, agonizingly silent groundwork behind the scenes is relentless. Sleepless musical archiving and conceptualizing during his alternative military service that served as the unseen, unbreakable gravitational pull bringing the 7 scattered pieces back perfectly into orbit. He didn't just wait for the reunion. He meticulously built the entire sonic stage for it in the dark, ensuring that when they finally stepped back into the blinding light together, they would be armed with the greatest music of their entire careers, proving once and for all that while other people love with their words, Min Yoongi loves with his life, his art, and his uncompromising, brutal dedication to his 6 brothers. So, if the cold, cynical producer is actually the fiercely protective, weeping heart of the group, what on earth happens when we shine the spotlight on the member who is literally known as the sunshine, the absolute paragon of hope, who secretly harbors a terrifying, relentless inner demon of perfectionism that drives the entire team to the brink of exhaustion? The emotional whiplash is far from over, and you won't believe the dark side of the brightest smile in K-pop. So are you ready for the next shocking revelation? Number 4. J-Hope. The terrifying sunshine, the shadow leader's iron discipline. When you hear the deafening, stadium-shattering chants of millions of armies screaming the name Jung Hoseok, the immediate, overwhelming image that floods the collective global consciousness is a blinding, radiant sphere of pure, unadulterated sunshine, a literal human vitamin who bounces onto the stage and introduces himself as your hope, with a heart-shaped smile that could instantly melt the polar ice caps and cure any bad day in a heartbeat. However, if you were to sneak past the towering, heavily guarded security gates of HYBE headquarters and quietly observe the grueling, sweat-drenched confines of their legendary underground dance studios, the choreographers, the backup dancers, and the veteran executive staff would immediately pull you aside and whisper deeply intimidating, completely mind-boggling tales about a man they respectfully and somewhat fearfully refer to as Team Leader Jung, a completely different, ferociously uncompromising entity who rules the performance aspect of BTS with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. According to the most candid, awe-struck accounts from HYBE's longest-serving performance directors, including the legendary Sun Sung-duk, the sheer, staggering duality of J-Hope is not merely a fascinating personality quirk. It is the absolute, undisputed backbone of the group's legendary, razor-sharp synchronization. A terrifyingly high standard of physical perfection that physically forces the other 6 members to push far past their biological limits just to avoid the dreaded, silent glare of disappointment from their dance captain, a look that sends literal shivers down the spine of even the fearless Jeon, Jungkook. You see, while RM is universally recognized as the brilliant, diplomatic brain of the operation, navigating the treacherous, shark-infested waters of global media and corporate expectations, and Suga is the silent, brooding sonic architect building their musical fortress in the dark, J-Hope is unequivocally recognized by the agency, and famously by RM himself, as the secondary, deeply emotional shadow leader who commands the physical and psychological atmosphere of the group behind closed doors, acting as the crucial, indestructible bridge perfectly positioned between the heavy, intellectual burden of the older Hyung line and the chaotic, deeply sensitive, fiercely energetic Magne line. Imagine the crushing, suffocating weight of being the designated happy pill for the biggest band in human history. The unspoken, terrifying obligation to constantly swallow your own exhaustion, your own crippling anxieties, and your own dark thoughts just to ensure the morale of the team never drops below a blazing 100%, relentless, daily emotional performance that HYBE psychologists have analyzed as one of the most staggering acts of sustained self-sacrifice ever recorded in the grueling, cutthroat history of the K-pop industry. Staff members still speak in hushed, tearful, reverent tones about the grueling world tours, those brutal nights when the adrenaline crashes, the bone-deep exhaustion sets in, and the other members would literally collapse onto the cold green room floor, entirely drained of life. It was always J-Hope, despite his own muscles screaming in sheer agony and his lungs burning like fire, who would miraculously summon a terrifying reserve of explosive energy, physically clapping his hands, shouting words of explosive encouragement, and literally pulling his exhausted brothers off the ground by their collars to get them back on that stage, purely because he refused to let them give anything less than absolute, blood-sweating perfection to the millions of fans waiting in the dark. But this relentless, almost manic drive for perfection comes at a deeply hidden, agonizing personal cost. Beneath the blinding smile lies a profound, terrifying fear of failure, a dark, suffocating anxiety that he finally boldly exposed to the world during his raw, unfiltered, grunge-heavy solo era, proving to the fans and to his own agency that his sunshine was never a naive, biological default, but rather a fiercely protected, painfully maintained choice he makes every single day to shield his members from the crushing darkness of their own colossal fame. The absolute, indisputable proof of his foundational, life-or-death importance to the group's survival traces all the way back to the deeply traumatic, tear-soaked pre-debut era, a period so dark and fraught with uncertainty that HYBE executives still get visibly emotional when discussing it, a time when an overwhelmingly stressed, completely hopeless J-Hope actually made the devastating decision to quit the group and leave the agency entirely, prompting a catastrophic emotional breakdown. Within the cramped dorm, where a fiercely sobbing Jungkook literally clung to his legs begging him to stay, and RM, dropping all his stoicism, forcefully marched into the executive offices, aggressively demanding that the company bring Hoseok back immediately because they simply could not survive without him, declaring him the only reason they functioned as a team. That historic, agonizing moment of near loss forged a permanent, unbreakable blood pact between him and the members, cementing his role as the absolute emotional compass of the group. The one man who can brutally scold V and Jimin for missing a complex dance step by a fraction of a millisecond, terrifying them into submission, only to immediately pull them into a suffocatingly warm, giggling embrace 5 minutes later to buy them ice cream and praise their efforts, ensuring that his strict, terrifying discipline is never, ever mistaken for a lack of unconditional, overwhelming love. The members themselves have openly confessed in deeply emotional, tear-jerking docu-series interviews that when the stadium lights go down and the cameras finally turn off, it is J-Hope who silently checks every single microphone, who intimately analyzes every member's physical condition with the eye of a hawk, and who provides the exact, precise emotional validation that RM desperately needs when the burden of global leadership becomes too suffocating to bear alone, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is the indispensable, soothing water that miraculously cools the blazing fire of their collective ambitions and prevents them from burning out entirely. Fast forward to the present reality of the historic, monumental 2026 reunion season, an era where the global stakes have never been astronomically higher, and HYBE insiders have exclusively revealed that it was precisely J-Hope, returning from his rigorous military service with a terrifyingly renewed, explosive sense of purpose, who instantly grabbed the reins of their monumental performance preparations, relentlessly dragging his brothers back into the suffocating heat of the practice rooms, practically forcing their aging, military-stiffened bodies to remember the legendary blood, sweat, and tears standard that made them global gods in the first place, absolutely refusing to let them settle for mere nostalgia when they still possess the power to conquer the world all over again. He didn't just wait passively for them to heal. He actively became the blazing furnace that forged their scattered pieces back into an indestructible diamond, proving that behind the loudest laughs and the brightest smiles beats the most ruthless, ferociously protective, and self-sacrificing heart in the entire music industry. So, if the radiant sunshine is actually the terrifying, disciplined mastermind behind their physical perfection, what completely unimaginable secrets are hidden inside the heart of the member who is globally worshipped as the ultimate, ethereal angel of the group, a man whose agonizing battle with his own reflection and terrifyingly deep emotional empathy practically tore him apart behind the scenes. The dive into the unseen abyss of their brotherhood is getting dangerously deep, and you absolutely will not believe what explosive emotional truths come next. Number 3. Jimin, the bleeding empath, the angel's brutal war with perfection. When you witness the breathtaking, gravity-defying elegance of Park Jimin gliding across a colossal stadium stage, his ethereal vocals piercing through the roaring screams of 100,000 adoring fans, the immediate, overwhelming assumption is that you are watching a natural-born prodigy, an angelic being who effortlessly radiates grace, kindness, and an almost supernatural level of blinding charisma. However, if you were to sit down in the highly confidential, dimly lit meeting rooms of HYBE and listen to the raw, unfiltered testimonies of the veteran vocal coaches, the exhausted choreographers, and the executives who have watched him grow from a terrified teenager into a global icon, they would paint a drastically different, deeply agonizing, and profoundly beautiful portrait of a man engaged in a terrifying, lifelong war with his own reflection. According to insider observations, Jimin's role within the intricate, deeply fragile emotional ecosystem of BTS is that of the ultimate bleeding empath, a human sponge who subconsciously absorbs the darkest anxieties, the silent tears, and the crushing fears of the other 6 members, often at the devastating expense of his own psychological well-being. To truly comprehend the staggering depth of Jimin's bond with his brothers, one must brutally rewind the clock to the agonizingly desperate pre-debut era, a time when a young, fiercely determined, yet overwhelmingly insecure boy from Busan arrived in Seoul as the very last trainee to join the debut lineup, facing a practically impossible deadline and the suffocating, terrifying reality that he could be cut from the group at any given second. The HYBE performance directors still recall with literal shivers how Jimin, driven by a desperate, blinding panic to catch up to the seasoned trainees like J-Hope and Jungkook, would subject his own body to a level of physical torture that bordered on the completely inhuman, surviving on barely 2 hours of sleep a night, practicing the same agonizing acrobatic flips on the cold, hard studio floor until his muscles completely gave out and his nose bled purely because the thought of letting his new brothers down was infinitely more terrifying than any physical agony he could ever endure. This brutal, forged-in-fire desperation birthed an unparalleled, fiercely protective loyalty to the team, transforming him into the undisputed emotional radar of BTS, the one member who can instantly, almost telepathically detect when another member is silently breaking down, even in the middle of a chaotic, deafening concert in a foreign country. When a member cries, it is a universally recognized fact within the agency that Jimin will be there within a fraction of a second, completely abandoning his own stage positioning, wrapping his entire body around them, and physically shielding them from the cameras while crying right alongside them, validating their pain with a raw, unfiltered empathy that psychological experts argue is the absolute, most vital emotional glue keeping the group from shattering under the immense, crushing pressure of their own stratospheric fame. But the most intensely scrutinized, heavily analyzed, and profoundly emotional relationship in Jimin's entire universe is undoubtedly his legendary, soulmate-level bond with his fellow 95-liner, Kim Tae-young, globally known as V, a dynamic so incredibly complex, so intensely passionate, and so fiercely loyal that it has literally inspired entire docu-series episodes. HYBE insiders note that the Vmin dynamic is a mesmerizing study in absolute polar opposites. While V is the free-spirited, wildly unpredictable, deeply intuitive artist who often floats in his own magnificent universe, Jimin is the intensely grounded, painfully overthinking perfectionist, and yet they are the absolute anchors to each other's sanity. The agency executives often chuckle, yet with tears in their eyes, when recalling the infamous, screaming fights of their youth, like the universally legendary dumpling incident, which wasn't just a petty squabble over food, but a deeply agonizing emotional explosion of two young, exhausted, profoundly stressed boys trying to figure out how to communicate their desperate need for each other's validation in a high-pressure cooker of idol training. That specific, tear-soaked conflict, which ended in hours of sobbing in the freezing park, fundamentally rewired their relationship, forging an indestructible, telepathic blood pact where they silently vowed to be each other's ultimate safe space. An agreement that culminated in the heartbreakingly beautiful, self-composed track Friends, which HYBE staff consider the most literal, unfiltered translation of a platonic soulmate bond ever recorded in music history. Yet, beneath this angelic, infinitely caring facade lies the darkest, most tragic secret that HYBE staff have fought for years to help Jimin overcome. His terrifyingly brutal, unrelenting self-hatred when it comes to his own performances, a dark, suffocating monster of perfectionism that makes J-Hope's strictness look entirely merciful. Vocal producers have helplessly watched Jimin completely break down in the recording booth, sobbing uncontrollably and violently cursing himself over a single, microscopic voice crack that literally no one else in the world could even hear, paralyzed by the agonizing, terrifying fear that he wasn't good enough, that he was the weak link, and that he was going to destroy the flawless legacy of his brothers. During the monumental, emotionally devastating Wings tour and the subsequent catastrophic crisis of 2018, it was the other members who had to physically intervene, surrounding him in cramped hotel rooms, holding his hands, and desperately begging him to see the magnificent, breathtaking artist that the rest of the world saw, forcing him to understand that his vulnerability, his raw, cracking voice, and his beautifully human mistakes were exactly what made him so incredibly, deeply loved. To witness this evolution is to witness a miracle, because the staff remembers the nights he would sleep in the dance studio mirrors, terrified that his body was betraying him. He pushed his dietary restrictions to life-threatening extremes, a tragic manifestation of his desperate desire to fit the agonizingly impossible beauty standards of an industry that demands absolute perfection from its idols. It was RM who would quietly order food and refuse to eat until Jimin took a bite, and it was Jeon who would playfully force-feed him during broadcasts, using humor to mask their profound, terrifying concern for his survival. This collective, desperate effort to save Jimin from his own mind forged a deeply intricate, unbreakable web of codependency, where the act of saving Jimin became the very thing that taught the rest of the group how to be a family. Furthermore, his dynamic with the golden magne, Jungkook, is a fascinating paradox that leaves psychological observers entirely captivated. Jimin fiercely babies Jungkook, showering him with an overwhelming, almost suffocating amount of physical affection and praise, constantly acting as his loudest cheerleader. Yet, simultaneously, Jimin relies on Jungkook's terrifyingly unwavering, stoic physical and emotional strength as a grounding force when his own anxieties threaten to swallow him whole. When the cameras cut away after a grueling 3-hour stadium performance, it is often Jungkook who physically carries a completely drained, practically unconscious Jimin off the stage, an incredibly moving reversal of roles where the younger brother becomes the unshakable pillar for the elder who just poured every single drop of his soul into the audience. This profound, unspoken exchange of emotional and physical energy is the exact reason why HYBE's internal documentary teams always keep a camera trained on Jimin. He is the absolute, unshielded beating heart of BTS, the emotional thermometer that dictates the temperature of the entire group. When Jimin is happy, the entire agency breathes a massive sigh of relief, because his laughter is a magnificent, contagious force that can instantly shatter the thickest, most suffocating tension. But when Jimin hurts, the entire foundation of BTS trembles in agony. Number 2. V. The eccentric anchor. The free spirit's unseen emotional gravity. When the global public looks at Kim Taehyung, Universally celebrated as the breathtakingly gorgeous V, they are immediately captivated by the aura of an untouchable cinematic muse, a man possessing a dangerously deep, soulful baritone voice and a visual perfection so staggeringly surreal that he frequently goes viral just for breathing or staring blankly into a camera lens at a red carpet event. However, if you were to unlock the heavily guarded, confidential psychological profiles maintained by HYBE's internal staff and speak directly to the exasperated yet deeply affectionate producers who have spent over a decade trying to decipher his completely unorthodox working methods, you would uncover the absolute most baffling, wildly unpredictable, yet profoundly essential emotional dynamic within the entire group. In the rigidly structured, meticulously calculated, and often suffocatingly robotic world of the K-pop industry, where every single idol is trained to perfectly memorize scripts, hit exact camera angles, and suppress their individuality for the sake of the collective, V is the magnificent, uncontrollable anomaly. A literal force of nature who operates on an entirely different emotional frequency. And according to Bang Si-hyuk himself, this very unpredictability is the secret, vital oxygen that keeps BTS from suffocating under their own massive global machinery. To understand the complex, deeply emotional roots of V's relationship with the other 6 members, you have to dig into one of the most agonizing, psychologically torturous periods of his life. His infamous, highly controversial tenure as the hidden member before their official debut in 2013, a grueling, tear-soaked era where a young, desperately lonely Taeyoung was forced to literally hide in the corners of their cramped dorm, completely erased from all pre-debut vlogs, concept photos, and social media posts, terrified beyond rational thought that the agency was going to drop him at the absolute last minute while his brothers were slowly building a fan base. HYBE executives now look back at that specific marketing strategy with a heavy heart, realizing that isolating him caused a profound trauma, but it simultaneously forged a desperate, almost aggressive emotional attachment to the other members, who secretly defied management rules behind closed doors just to include him, sneaking him food, whispering words of encouragement, and fiercely promising him that they would never, ever debut without him standing right beside them. This agonizing crucible of forced invisibility birthed V's incredibly unique, profoundly intense love language. He doesn't communicate his affection through standard, predictable idol platitudes, but rather through deeply intuitive, fiercely physical, and often delightfully bizarre gestures that completely shatter the rigid walls of professionalism the other members try to maintain. He is the member who will suddenly, without any warning, wrap his long limbs around a completely exhausted, hyper-focused Suga in the middle of an intensely serious recording session, utterly refusing to let go until the famously stoic rapper finally breaks character and cracks a gummy smile, effectively short-circuiting the crippling tension in the room with pure, unadulterated, chaotic love. His dynamic with RM is an absolute masterclass in opposite forces achieving perfect harmony. While the leader processes the world through a deeply intellectual, highly analytical, and heavily burdened philosophical lens, constantly overthinking every single global consequence, V processes the universe through raw, unfiltered, intuitive emotion, often shocking the genius RM with incredibly profound, out-of-the-box observations that cut straight through the complex noise and solve a problem with staggering simplicity, reminding the leader that sometimes you don't need a 10-page essay to understand a feeling. You just need to close your eyes and listen to the jazz playing in the background. His bond with the eldest, Jeon, is practically a secret weapon deployed by the agency's psychological team. Whenever the crushing gravity of their colossal fame threatens to suffocate the joy out of the room, Jeon and V instantly lock eyes and engage in the most ridiculous, hyper-theatrical, completely nonsensical role plays, shamelessly sacrificing their visual dignity to fill the room with thunderous, infectious laughter, proving that true brotherhood means never being afraid to look entirely Foolish as long as it makes your family smile. Meanwhile, his deeply complex, fiercely protective dynamic with the youngest, Jungkook, is a beautiful evolution that leaves Doku's series editors weeping in the editing room. V was the exact eccentric catalyst who forcefully, relentlessly drag an intensely shy, painfully introverted teenage Jungkook out of his shell, practically forcing the younger boy to embrace his own weirdness, only to beautifully step back years later and watch with absolute, glowing pride as Jungkook transformed into a global pop titan, constantly trading the roles of the mischievous instigator and the comforting silent rock. But the most emotionally devastating, fiercely protective side of V was fully unleashed during his monumental, terrifying foray into the acting world with the historical drama Warang, a period that HYBE staff describe as an absolute psychological nightmare for the young star, who was simultaneously juggling an impossibly grueling world tour schedule while being paralyzed by the suffocating, terrifying fear that his lack of acting experience would bring immense shame and ruin to the flawless reputation of BTS. Behind the scenes, away from the glittering movie sets and the cheering stadium crowds, V was silently crumbling under the astronomical pressure, his usual bright, eccentric energy replaced by a dark, terrifyingly quiet anxiety that alarmed the entire agency. It wasn't until a deeply emotional, tear-drenched night in a foreign hotel room that his walls finally shattered, and he completely broke down sobbing in front of all 6 members, agonizingly confessing his terrifying insecurities and his desperate, suffocating fear of letting them down. According to insider accounts, the members didn't offer him empty, corporate words of encouragement. Instead, Jimin held him tightly while shedding his own tears. Jeon used his own acting background to meticulously, patiently run through every single line of the script with him until dawn, and the entire rap line collectively reminded him that they were an indestructible fortress, that his individual failures were their failures, and that he would never have to carry the crushing weight of the world alone. A monumental turning point that permanently transformed V from a boy who felt like a hidden outsider into a fiercely confident man who knew his soul was fundamentally tethered to 6 others. Now, as we stand in the awe-inspiring, historically unprecedented era of the 2026 reunion, the breathtakingly matured, devastatingly sophisticated Kim Tae-young has returned from the rigorous discipline of the military not with an internalized rigidity, but with a magnificent, explosive resurgence of his artistic freedom, injecting a desperately needed, soul-stirring spontaneity directly into the veins of their heavily anticipated comeback preparations. HYBE staff are completely mesmerized as they watch him in the practice rooms, fearlessly tossing out the meticulously planned, highly choreographed formulas, demanding that the group embrace a rawer, more organic, jazz-infused stage presence, effectively reminding his brothers that after conquering the entire universe, enduring the agonizing separation of the military, and surviving the brutal machinery of the idol industry, their greatest weapon isn't their perfect synchronization anymore, but their fiercely authentic, completely unshackled, beautiful human connection that no agency, no script, and no choreography could ever possibly manufacture. Number 1. Jungkook, the golden canvas, the magne who breathes for his 6 brothers. When the entire global population hears the monumental, universally recognized title of the Golden Magne, referring to Jungkook, the immediate, overwhelming image that dominates the screen is a terrifyingly flawless, invincible pop titan who effortlessly shatters global Billboard records, an absolute prodigy who can sing like an angel, dance like a seasoned veteran, rap, paint, direct, and conquer literally any physical challenge thrown his way without breaking a single sweat. However, if you were to bypass the glittering, blinding lights of his colossal solo success and sit down in the deeply confidential, tear-soaked interview rooms of HYBE's internal documentary teams, the veteran producers and the founders of the agency would desperately beg you to look past the golden armor to see the most emotionally staggering, beautifully fragile, and fiercely loyal heart in the entire K-pop industry. A young man whose entire universe, whose very reason for breathing, is entirely tethered to the 6 older brothers who practically raised him from a terrified child into a global god. To truly, profoundly understand the sheer devastating gravity of Jungkook's relationship with BTS, you must ruthlessly rewind the timeline back to the year 2011, to a pivotal, historically monumental crossroad where a painfully shy, 13-year-old boy with doe eyes participated in an audition program and was instantly, aggressively scouted by 7 of the most powerful, resource-rich entertainment agencies in South Korea, companies that could have guaranteed him a fast, luxurious path to stardom. Yet in a move that still leaves HYBE executives absolutely speechless and deeply emotional to this day, this young boy rejected all of those massive corporate giants and willingly walked into the mold-infested, desperately poor, near-bankrupt basement of Big Hit Entertainment for one single, life-altering reason. He saw a teenage Kim Namjoon, known today as RM, fiercely rapping in the studio, and was so profoundly, intensely mesmerized by his aura that he decided right then and there to entrust his entire life, his youth, and his future to this stranger. This is the absolute, foundational secret of Jungkook that psychological analysts at HYBE constantly point out. He didn't just sign a contract with a company. He essentially forged a permanent, unbreakable blood pact with a person, and subsequently with the 5 other young men who populated that freezing dorm. The early pre-debut years were a harrowing, deeply agonizing trial of extreme introversion for the young magne, a period where he was so completely, terrifyingly paralyzed by shyness that he would literally wait until all 6 of his exhausted older brothers had fallen into a deep sleep before he dared to quietly creep into the cramped bathroom just to take a shower, terrified of taking up space or being an inconvenience. But what happened next is considered by Bang Si-hyuk to be the greatest, most miraculous achievement in the history of the agency. Instead of letting the ruthless, cutthroat, idol training system crush this fragile boy, the 6 older members instinctively, fiercely transformed into a collective surrogate family, pouring every single ounce of their love, their resources, and their distinct personalities into raising him. Jeon, practically a child himself, used his own allowance to buy him groceries and drove him to his high school entrance exams. Suga, despite his gruff exterior, silently watched over his meals and protected him from the harsh criticisms of trainers. J-Hope painstakingly mentored his body, teaching him how to channel his raw energy into breathtaking choreography. RM expanded his mind, carefully nurturing his intellect and his lyrical voice, while the fiercely loving soulmates, Jimin and V, practically forced him out of his suffocating shell, relentlessly dragging him into their chaotic playfulness until he finally learned how to laugh out loud. Because of this unimaginably deep, collective rearing process, HYBE staff frequently described Jungkook as a literal, beautiful amalgamation of all 6 members, an artist who absorbed the absolute best qualities of his brothers to become the ultimate performer. But this profound connection birthed a terrifyingly deep, emotional vulnerability that completely shattered the agency executives during a legendary, deeply emotional evaluation meeting in 2016. At the time, the grueling, bone-crushing schedule of their sudden rise to fame was physically destroying the group, and when Bang Si-hyuk asked the members about their hardships, the notoriously stoic Jungkook, who had famously never once complained about the agonizing physical pain, the relentless sleep deprivation, or the suffocating pressure of being the center of the group, suddenly broke down into violent, uncontrollable sobs that shocked the entire room into complete, terrified silence. Through his tears, he agonizingly confessed that his own exhaustion meant absolutely nothing to him. But watching his 6 older brothers silently suffer through their mental and physical tortures and feeling utterly, helplessly incapable of taking their pain away, was a psychological agony that was literally tearing his heart into pieces. This devastating, intensely raw revelation became the exact inspiration for his first ever solo track, Begin, a song that HYBE producers view as the ultimate, unfiltered thesis statement of Jungkook's soul. He explicitly declares that he had nothing, that he was utterly empty, until his brothers gave him emotions, gave him a voice, and gave him a reason to exist, cementing the terrifyingly beautiful reality that his pain is never his own, but entirely a reflection of theirs. This staggering empathy explains the terrifying, heart-stopping moments during their massive world tours, like the infamous, panic-inducing incident in Chile during the Wings tour, where Jungkook pushed his body so far past the limits of human endurance that he literally collapsed backstage, completely relying on medical oxygen to breathe, not because he wanted the glory, but because he was paralyzed by the suffocating fear of letting down the fans and, more importantly, letting down the brothers who had sacrificed their youth to build this dream. When the youngest falls, the entire foundation of BTS shakes violently. The frantic, tear-filled eyes of RM, Jeon, Suga, J-Hope, Jimin, and V, as they desperately hovered around his nearly unconscious body backstage, prove that beneath the polished pop star veneer, they're just terrified older brothers desperate to protect their child. And now, as the global atmosphere ignites with the historically unprecedented, earth-shattering reality of the 2026 reunion, the most profound, emotionally devastating evolution has finally come full circle within the walls of HYBE. The fragile, painfully shy teenager who used to wait in the dark to shower has returned from the grueling reality of his military service as a breathtakingly massive, indestructible physical and emotional giant, completely dominating the global pop industry as a legendary solo titan. Yet, the moment he steps back into the practice room with his 6 brothers, the global armor vanishes instantly. Executive staff are frequently brought to tears watching the intensely powerful, heavily tattooed, 28-year-old Jungkook practically reverting back to his purest, most devoted self, looking at his older brothers with the exact same starry-eyed, absolute adoration he had when he was 13 years old, but with a monumental difference. He is no longer the baby needing their constant protection. Instead, he has become the unshakable, towering pillar of strength that physically and emotionally supports them, using his staggering, boundless energy to carry the intense physical demands of their heavily anticipated comeback, proudly standing as the invincible vanguard so his brothers can shine brighter than ever before. This is the ultimate, breathtaking truth of Jungkook, the Golden Magne. He conquered the entire universe, broke every conceivable musical record, and became a god among men, not for his own glory, but simply because he wanted to be a man worthy of the 6 brothers who saved his life, proving that the most powerful force in the history of music isn't talent, wealth, or fame, but the agonizingly beautiful, unbreakable blood oath of 7 boys who chose to become a family against all the odds of the universe.